Okay, let me please introduce now to our first guest speaker, our keynote speaker, Dr. Kyle Mulrooney. Kyle holds a PhD in Cultural and Global Criminology from the Universities of Kent and Hamburg, an MA in the Sociology of Law from the International Institute for the Sociology of Law, and a BA Honours in Criminology and Justice from Ontario Technical University. Kyle has a particular interest in questions of how we as a society determine what is considered criminal, how we then respond to crime, and why we elect particular solutions in doing so. Kyle's current research centres on rural criminology and explores how aspects of cultural geography and locational context impact upon the types, incidents and responses to crime and access to related services. He has published on issues ranging from crime prevention and policing to drug consumption and criminal justice. Kyle serves as the co-director of the Centre for Rural Criminology at the University of New England and as the vice president of the International Society for the Study of Rural Crime. He is a recognised international expert in rural criminology, and his research and work are being distilled and utilised by policymakers and industry in practice. I'll also add that Kyle has been significant in the development of a new course in neuroscience and criminology, so his talents span far and wide. Kyle, can I introduce you to the stage? Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Vicki and Trevor, for this invitation. So, yeah, Vicki approached me and asked me to do this. And to be quite honest, it's been a while since I've been in the youth crime space specifically. I work across crime prevention in rural spaces, which naturally interfaces with youth. I work with policing and these types of things. But it's been a long time since I took a good hard look at the issue or problem that youth face, especially in rural communities. Now, my early days, I was a child and youth worker. So I had a lot of on-the-ground practical experience, but it's been nearly 20 years since I've done that. One of the charges that was given for me today was to do our very best to not take a deficit-based approach, to not start in the negative, which is where we often sometimes are forced to go when we're talking about these challenging problems, especially with young people. So today I'd like us to think probably a bit idealistically. I think what I'm going to talk about today hopefully suggests that everyone can be involved in crime prevention, that crime prevention in rural spaces is something that doesn't necessarily need to be called crime prevention. It's something that can be built into the very fabric of our communities and our societies. So the first part is this notion of why place? Why does place matter? And like I said, I'm not an expert in youth crime or youth crime prevention. There's probably many people in the audience that are much more learned and experienced than me on that. But where my expertise does lie is in that nexus of place and space and how that interfaces with crime, whether that be in policing and crime prevention. And I think space has to be at the absolute foreground. And what I mean by space in this context is rurality and how that shapes different things. So central to that is rural criminology, which is just a sub-branch of criminology, which is really focused on how geographic isolation, community, the social networks and density therein shape things like crime, what types of crime occur, crime salience, victimization, access to criminal justice services, and access to associated services like health and well-being related services. How is this composed in rural spaces, and what kind of impact does that have on crime? So there's a few quick examples I can give you to try to paint that picture. Now, rural criminology looks at quintessential rural crimes, perhaps the most quintessential rural crime being stock theft. But it has interesting spatial dynamics that structure how it occurs, right? Stock is worth a lot of money. It's sitting in the middle of a wide open paddock. There are very limited technological inputs in place to try to prevent this crime. There's very few formal guardians in these areas like police, security guards, these types of things, and very few informal guardians. The farmer may not even live on property and there's not people bustling about. Now compare that to a busy city street and someone wants to rob a bank. It doesn't happen very often in 2025, right? The environment itself is literally built with crime prevention in mind. There's copious amounts of tools and technological tools at one's disposal to prevent crime. And so if we sometimes think of crime as risk reward and rational choice on offenders' behalf, then you can see how in rural environments, particularly with the example of stock theft, that there is that criminogenic environment is there. It's ripe for crime and opportunistic type crime. Now, rural criminology is bigger than quintessential rural crimes. It also looks at crimes that unfortunately happen everywhere. So we can think about domestic violence. So domestic violence and family violence happens everywhere. Urban, regional, remote communities, it sort of doesn't discriminate in that regards. But how it occurs and how it's responded to can very much be shaped by place and space. And I want that sort of as the center of our framework as we're looking tonight. So an example of that is quite obviously access to services. The services may not simply be available in rural spaces as they are in urban spaces. The ability to actually go to and from those services if transportation is not readily available and these types of things. There's also cultural dimensions to space too. We can think about rural communities being sparsely populated, but really socially dense. People know each other. People have relationships. These relationships cross many, many spheres. So if you're a victim, you have those elements of shame, of privacy, and issues to sort of report this. Perhaps your abuser is coaching the local soccer team with one of the head of the police, right? And so you've got these intricate relationships. And that is just a good example of how place and space very much shapes how crime occurs. And I think we can try to understand youth crime in this regard as well. So in terms of how it actually impacts crime, I think it can be distilled down into these 3Ds: distance, how far; density, how many within reach; and dispersion, how spread are these physical levers within a community. But it's important that place is not the backdrop. When we think about crime causation, we think about things like exposure, guardianship, and access. And this is really important because I'd like to show us the risks in rural communities that mean there can be high levels of exposure, guardianship, and access, or reduced access in rural spaces, but how we might go about trying to sort of turn those tables and ensure that we build safe communities for young people. Sorry, it keeps wanting to force an IT update on me. Should probably update more. So the rural risk environment. So if place changes that issue of exposure, guardianship, and access, which is so central to crime and also crime prevention, where do these changes actually show up? And I think we can really use this risk protection framework, which looks at different domains, elements, and levels within rural communities that we can identify. And more importantly, we can identify how they overlap and really how they bite and make crime likely or make harm likely. So a good example comes from a research paper we wrote a number of years ago where we were challenged by some data which showed regardless of opioid use levels, deaths were much, much higher in rural communities. And so we wanted to understand why this was the case. What is it about rural communities that's leading to more harms and more people dying from opioid use? And so we applied this risk framework to try to understand that. And we're able to look at the literature. So we conducted a systematic literature review to find the available evidence out there that could point us to these harms. And we see a number of these overlapping areas across domains, levels, and elements. For example, we find that opioid deaths or harms related to opioids rise where there's economic strain, coupled with that distance or dispersion, stigma, and low anonymity, so those social relationships that we talked about, and misfitting services. When these coincide, it creates a very messy storm. This jointly shifts that exposure. It limits guardianship and delays or altogether inhibits access that in this context could be actually helpful for mitigating harm from opioid use. So I think we can apply this same diagnostic tool to try to understand place and space with respect to youth crime. And so I won't go through all of this, but it's simply a matrix which shows us the different elements or domains that are of particular interest, that are spatially oriented, and how these occur across different levels, at the individual level, at the institutional level, and at the more macro sort of market-based level. So if we just look at space or the physical built environment for young people, if we think at that micro peers family routines level, we can consider how young people have those after school gaps or how there are risky third places that they may be participating in. We think at the meso level, we think about those licensing gates or those transportation gates that restrict youth to certain areas. We think about few supervised sites and opportunities for pro-social activity for young people. At the macro level, we think about that issue of distance and dispersion, but also the broader infrastructure deficits, those things that are available for young people to actually engage and participate in pro-social activities. If we move on down to economic stress, we look at that across these three levels. Individually, this is boredom and idle time. Boredom and idle time usually equals crime. That wasn't supposed to rhyme, but it did. I think one of the things of cultural criminology, probably their best contribution, is the obvious. Young people engage in crime in part because it's fun. I think to deny that is to sort of lose sight of sort of that young person's capacity to engage in these types of things. So boredom and idle time is something that needs to be taken seriously. Participation costs for actually engaging. I'll talk about civic community and its role, the participation costs of actually engaging and the barriers therein. We look at that meso level and the few opportunities for local roles, very few mentors, thin apprenticeship pathways. These are so important to create opportunity for young people. And then at the more macro level, simply deindustrialization, loss of jobs, loss of opportunity, constant churn, having to look elsewhere for economic opportunity, or worse, having to look towards crime and criminal opportunity, both for identity, money, opportunity, what have you. Now, it's a bit more positive from here, I promise. So we have our diagnostic tool, that risk framework, where we can try to see how spatial elements are aligning or worse, misaligning, and might create a rural risk environment that's quite conducive to young people offending. This tells us where the environment might misalign, but we need to put this concept of community at the absolute forefront of our preventative efforts. And that's community as lived. I'll unpack that in a second. But this is the concept of community both as the method and medium to try to realign those issues, to realign those risks, particularly related to crime, and that's that exposure, guardianship, and access. So I think the really important thing here is to think about what community is. And there's a great sociologist from New Zealand, Ruth Liepins, who wrote about the concept of community 25 years ago now. And it's still quite powerful, I think, especially when we think about how important place and space is. We think about community, we think about the Armidale community, we tend to think about spatially oriented things, where it is, it's rural and regional. It might have some connection to UNE or something like that, like identifying factors, but they tend to be spatially oriented. But how community is lived at the individual level is often much different, and there are a number of components to it. So we can think about meaning and what communities mean to people and how people can formulate or how they live identities through this. We can think about practices. What do people actually do within communities? We think about the social relations, which are probably all the more important at the rural level, where popular or social density is so obvious, and those networks they're in, and then of course the spaces in which they occur. So it's this holistic view of community, I think, that we need to try to take with us when we're applying into crime prevention. And I'll show you that in a moment in relation to civic community. So If prevention just focuses on space as a spatial orientation, as a physical orientation, it will miss those important elements of local meanings and practices, or the way that community is understood and performed, especially by young people. And it will fail. And I think that youth prevention must work with community as it's lived by young people. So who is trusted? Where does belonging happen? How are boundaries drawn within communities? So community is part of that environment. It's part of that importance of place and space. But I think on a more positive note, it is the part that we can deliberately remake, that we can all actually play a role in addressing, in making better. And I think by doing so, it gives us a different approach. Rather than treating youth crime through clinical services or very focused, narrow intervention points, which are probably important. This is looking at how the wider community and its relation in particular to civic community can actually address these issues of youth crime. So I think in particular, if we can thicken meanings, practices, relations, and spaces, then we can actually work to realign that risk framework on the previous slide. We can realign those issues of exposure, of guardianship, and of access that we know empirically contribute to crime and are so important for crime prevention. So let's move this into some practical examples of civic community. So community tells us how change can stick, how community is lived and experienced through young people. But civic community, particularly civic community theory, tells us what levers we can actually push and pull to try to reduce crime. Civic community theory has a very long-standing development in criminological literature and more recently applied to rural spaces. And basically, without getting too far into the weeds, what it tells us is that there's lower crime where civility is strong. That might seem obvious, but the opposite's true as well. And how they measure civility, particularly, is three ways. There are three levers. One is residential stability, so who's here, who belongs here. The other is local economic rootedness. We can think about local small businesses, small medium enterprises, and participation therein. And the other is civic engagement density. So those associations, those congregations, and the turnout to civic community. And so the more of this we have, the stronger of this in communities, including rural communities, most of the research comes out of the United States, the less crime that is present. If you can get people to engage with civic community, you can reduce crime in a roundabout, natural way. So I think the importance about this is that, again, it's not focused specifically on a crime problem or a specific issue. That's important. If it's motor vehicle theft, if it's break and enters, if there are certain things. This is a holistic community-based approach to crime where we start from civic life and participation and opportunity and the role of local institutions therein. And it reads crime through those changes in civility. If we can create a more civil environment, a participatory environment for young people where there's opportunity, there is less likelihood for crime to occur. So for rural youth, each lever can shape those dimensions of criminality, that exposure, guardianship, and access. Importantly, it can supply things that are so paramount to everyone, but especially young people who may be engaging in crime. Those issues of identity, opportunity, recognition, and fun. So rather than add more youth programs, what civic community theory is telling us is that we have to strengthen the civic ecology of communities and encourage participation in that ecology for young people. Give them something to hold on to and give them some buy-in to something much bigger. So I just want to give a few examples of how that might work in practice in terms of civic community theory and those pathways for young people. So if we think about residential stability, what we're really talking about there is who stays and for how long. And that's been a long-standing thing in criminology as it pertains to social disorganization. The importance of embedded, connected communities and people who know each other and stick around. And so that youth mechanism, right, it creates a continuity of trusted adults and friend groups and peers. It provides everyday guardianship, but naturally so, not induced or imposed, natural guardianship. Reputational trust lowers the cost for young people to ask for help. And there's fewer fresh starts or recess in a community-oriented environment like this. If we think about local economic rootedness, that's the idea of who invests here, that youth mechanism is that it provides visible, legitimate roles to gain skill, money, purpose, and respect. I see someone from Backtrack here, for instance. That's a great example of that. The embeddedness of skill within that program, of giving young people an opportunity that they can actually learn a skill, leverage, and apply is so paramount. I'll get into it in a minute when it pops up, but something as simple as a driver's license. Like, we don't think about a driver's license being important to crime prevention, but this is what we mean. A driver's license is absolutely central in a rural community for participation in civil society. Without it, you have nothing. And so it's such a little thing, but it can go such a long way, I think, in crime prevention. We think about civic engagement density. This is about where belonging happens. And this is a bit trickier because it requires the institutions to be there and available. But we think about dense overlapping associations and memberships which create frequent adult contact for young people and make introductions easy. You've got identity-rich roles, whether it be PCYC, which we'll hear from, sports club shows, RFS, and the like, as well as events. The Culture Fest recently is a great example of these types of community-oriented events. These can supply young people with status and excitement that compete with offending when taken together holistically. So what changes, I think this is important, is these levers don't refer young people to specific services. They're not there to identify a problem and try to address it. They're really there to try to bend everyday life for young people so that the safe choice is also the rewarding one for them, the one in which provides them with some stake, some opportunity, some engagement. All right, so I want to show this in a bit more applied way with that civic community theory. What does that mean in this context? So we have to make these levers work for youth, right? We can't just simply push and pull them. I think that's where we have to have that concept of community that I brought up earlier, absolutely embedded in any interventions around civic community, right? We have to try to shift those meanings, practices, and relations and spaces so that the community actually naturally inducts young people into everyday civil society. So meaning is this concept of who counts as one of us, right? And there's simple ways that we can do that as examples. Make youth visible as civic contributors, not as clients. Visibility through shows, markets, youth voices in local media, give them a stake, a place. Small but decisive capability, there it is. That's what I spoke about. In rural places, a driver's license is a ticket to civic participation. It needs to be understood as a part of that civic belonging, not a bureaucratic exercise for young people to jump through. Practices, what do people do together in community? This is about building predictable weekly rhythms where youth already gather. It might be a sports field, sheds, libraries, showgrounds, so that help, mentoring roles, adult participation and supervision are accessed not for crime prevention purposes, but just as part as ordinary participation in civic community life. So it's that mantra that civic practice beats service appointment. It's that civic practice that should be built in for young people. Social relations, this is who bridges who. I've never seen a successful venture, let alone a crime prevention effort, succeed without local champions, without those people that can connect all these threads together. And when we're thinking about that from a civil society perspective or from a community perspective, it's all the more important that those threads are tied and attached, and we do our best to do that. So we have to name those connectors: elders, school staff, PCYC coaches, faith clubs, service clubs. and normalize those handovers as natural within these settings. And that stability of connectors, right? The continuity of community support makes it less clinical, less obvious, more natural. And finally, spaces. This is where communities performed. Use spaces with civic meaning, with privacy for young people. The clubroom, the shed, the hall, seeking support for young people needs to just be seen as showing up rather than reaching out and being singled out. So this is where civic community theory and community as conceived of broadly have to come together. That notion of community, its relevance in relation to place and space, has to be central to any efforts within civic community theory to try to reduce crime amongst young people. If our moves don't actually shift this dial, if they don't change meanings for young people, the practices, the relations, their experience of places in community, they won't change youth pathways. Because community is just something that people do. And so I think, again, that important thing is about not referring youth to particular services, but just trying to induct them into community life. This is the last slide, I promise. I just want to try to bring that whole pathway together. And that is looking at each of these empirically evidenced levers that serve to reduce crime in the context of what we talked about today: place and space, that risk environment, the community, and then a little so what, meaning what relevance does this have for crime prevention for young people? So if we think about residential stability and we think about rural spaces, we think about in sparse settings, fewer resets mean you keep seeing familiar faces. This builds trust, accountability, recognition, these types of things. If we think about the risk environment that we spoke about, that continuity, especially at that mid-level and at that individual level, can turn naturally into everyday guardianship through those relationships being developed. From a community perspective, it's so important that we actually back these relationships, that stable connectors and recurring spaces where the same people are participating and are relied upon week after week, not for crime prevention purposes, but as a natural part of their role in the community and in civil society. We think about local economic rootedness, which is so important. Place and space, work and mentors remain local, so young people don't have to leave to find roles or to find opportunity through crime. We think about the risk environment, especially at that mid and macro level, and the idea of trying to expand role supply within small communities is difficult. But trying to offer youth an opportunity for structured time, especially for opportunity into the future, with visible adults around. Community in this context is about making practice and spaces work integrated and oriented, doubling areas as civic venues, but also opportunities for mentorship and work opportunity for young people. And I think the so what here from a crime perspective is that this buy-in, especially this economic opportunity and buy-in that is so important to young people's future, it reduces that idle exposure and it replaces it with purposeful, meaningful routines for young people that are so important. And in this way, we bake guardianship into every day, and access or opportunity for help for young people is shortened. Finally, the civic engagement density. This is a trickier one again, because it's based on institutions and accessibility, which isn't always there in rural spaces. But it's trying to identify realistic venues within travel reach and overlapping membership to these places in civil society so that they have those handoffs, they have those connections, and you're sort of creating that web of natural participation in community life. Thinking about it from the perspective of the risk environment, this gives us more frequent micro contacts and coordination, which can assist with guardianship. And in terms of community, we can try to grow those identity-rich roles for young people. Places where youth actually have an opportunity to gain respect, status, and I think above all, opportunity. And so what this does, again, naturally, is that time shifts into supervised, identity-rich settings for young people. Guardianship is nearby, it's also natural and routine again, and access is fast and stigma-free because it's not focused on the particular wrongdoing of a particular individual. Okay, so just to wrap up and bring that all together, if there are any takeaways from this, it's these. First and foremost is place sets the conditions. We cannot forget about the role of place as it pertains to any crime, not least youth crime. You cannot simply transplant an urban youth intervention and think it is going to apply the same way you can't transplant urban criminological social disorganization theory and think it's going to work to understand crime in rural communities. It just doesn't work. Our rural opioid review shows that harms concentrate where there's a mismatch, particularly between service norms and space. And I think this same pattern can help us predict and understand the pressure points or where it might bite for youth and where we can intervene through community and civic community. So community, we need to conceptualize this as lived, especially as lived, understood, and experienced by young people, which is probably very different than us. This is the method. This is how we align those issues that we've identified that may be out of whack in that rural risk environment. Civic community theory gives us the empirical evidence. It shows us what those levers are, but those levers alone simply aren't enough. For youth, moving those levers will change that risk environment for them. It will lower those harms because it supplies things like identity, opportunity, recognition, or excitement for young people. And I think that's really it. It's that it can't just be about pulling those levers, about trying to have people remain in space, working towards economic rootedness and civic engagement density. It really has to be built in to that excitement, status, recognition. If civic life can't offer that for young people, if they don't see it as something tangible, reachable for them, for whatever reason and however many barriers, then crime offers that. It really, truly does. Crime, there's a great deal of literature around status frustration and these types of things. Believe it or not, crime will supply identity. It will supply opportunity. It will supply recognition, and it definitely will supply excitement. And that has great harm, especially in small, tight-knit rural communities, and we've seen it. So again, that's not enough. We need to pull those levers through what community means as lived. So we need to pull this notion of stability, of rootedness, of civic density through community. We have to recompose everyday rural life so that these issues related to crime, exposure, guardianship, access, all tilt very naturally towards safety. So taken together, I think it's this, if I had to give my presentation in one line, place sets the conditions. And I think that's so important to understand place central to this. The risk environment shows us where those conditions can cause harm, where they might bite, where they might hurt for youth. CCT specifies those levers that we can pull to reduce crime, those evidence-based levers that we can pull to reduce crime. But that alone isn't enough. Building community is how we actually make those levers stick for young people. That's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Excellent. That was an amazing presentation. Kyle, you've left us with a template that I feel like we need to get together and discuss as a group of people to start mapping out what we can do to assist young people to, I guess, have more meaning and more purpose, as you mentioned. So just to signal to you what's going to happen next, we're going to look at having a panel of people who are going to take some questions from me to start off with. And then we've got time for you to give the panel your own questions and to add your comments to what we're doing. To start off with, to lead the panel discussion, I'd like to introduce the Mayor of Armidale, Sam Coupland. Sam was raised in a mixed farming property east of Tamworth and came to Armidale for school and university. After 20 years working in Sydney and abroad, he and his wife chose to raise their children in Armidale so they could enjoy all of the benefits of a thriving regional community. And our mayor's going to give us a big picture perspective on the topic that we're all interested in tonight. Let me welcome you, Sam.
Thank you. Actually, it's not thank you. I want to thank Kyle. I always enjoy having my vocabulary broadened, and civic community theory is something that had never crossed my mind. I'd never heard of it, but when Kyle was speaking, there was so much there that I could really relate to. And in a way, I was really heartened because crime is not something that is front and center of council. It's not what we do. We don't look at things necessarily through the lens of crime, but there is so much that you spoke about: residential stability, local economic rootedness, and civic engagement. They are the things that we are trying to do. And to hear that that can be the success or otherwise of that can be sheeted home to alleviating crime. We're not going to get rid of it, but certainly minimize it and stop people falling through the cracks. I was massively, massively heartened by that. So from a council perspective, and when it comes to crime and any of these sorts of things, we are a secondary or possibly even a tertiary, component to all of this. We're certainly not frontline. We'd never intend to be, and I don't think we are the ones who should come up with solutions. We happen to be the ones that have money and we have spaces, and that's where we can influence when directed by those that know what they're talking about. So actually, in this role as mayor, one of the things that often frustrates me is that the complex problems need to be solved by clever people who are experienced. What doesn't solve things are enthusiastic, opinionated amateurs who happen to be loud. That said, the bulk of my time is spent with enthusiastic, opinionated amateurs. That's fine, but as long as the people who actually have control of the steering wheel are the geeks, all will be good. That's one of these things. But when it comes to what you were talking about, your civic community theory, the growth agenda of council is absolutely, it is that. So one of the things when I came on to council 4 years ago was with an aggressive growth agenda. We are too small as a region. We're 30,000 people. And at that size, you are overlooked by state government. You just don't attract their attention, no matter how how grand we think we are, how important our institutions are, how loud we are, how much money we make, how long our families have been here. Steve, I realise your family's been here for a little bit longer than mine, but all of that pales to insignificance. The state wants to pick winners, and winners are growing regions, and we have not been a winner for 30 years. And so we need to turn that around. We have tried to shrink our way to success or hide our way to success. And so one of the first things that happened in the previous term of council, we adopted a really aggressive growth agenda to get to 40,000 people as quickly as we possibly can, and then on to 50. Because at 40,000 it seems to be the magic number. That's where you attract state government investment, and where government money goes, private money follows. And we need to do that in a really clever way. So that growth agenda is absolutely key to this being the most livable region in New South Wales. So the first one, and just maybe linking it back to Kyle's CCT, was residential stability. I've seen this in other regions. There are some regions developers will not go to. And that's partly because of red tape, but that's not really it. A lot of it is there an economic return? Because building costs are higher the more remote you go. Yet the more remote you go, housing prices are less. So the margins just aren't there for developers. And this probably won't come as a surprise to anyone, but developers tend not to be the most benevolent people around. They are probably some of those people with the sharpest economic elbows. They will make a buck. And if they can't make a buck, no one can. So we need to be the sort of place where developers are keen to build. And we are starting to see that. We have 800 new lots being developed around Armidale at the moment, with plenty more to come. In fact, one of the first things, and this is part of that growth agenda, we had a group called Macro Plan in. There was a former chief planning officer from New South Wales, former head of chief economist, sorry, of Westpac, and a whole bunch of boffins. This is about getting clever people in the room. And with them and a few others, we're able to identify 8,800 building lots within Armidale and surrounds. Most of them are in Armidale. About 800 potentially up at Gyra, and then a few others sprinkled around the villages. But the bulk here is Armidale. So where can we logically extend? And we have had that ticked off by the state government, because you can't just go and subdivide anywhere. The state has a real say over all of this. So we had to get our house in order and sort that out. And that's the sort of thing that will improve residential stability. Access to land, and that'll lead to houses, etc., etc. Another thing that we did was reduce our minimum lot size to 450 square metres, because there are a lot of lots in Armidale that are about 900. So if people want to battle axe or subdivide, build granny flats, they can. So that was to make just to remove legislative impediments to infill. That said, developers won't infill here because economically it doesn't stack up. So we will continue as a region here to expand out. It's probably not till our median house prices hit $800,000 or $900,000 that economically it would stack up to infill. So regional areas will always expand outwards until prices happen there. I guess, the $600,000 house doesn't prevent crime. Affordable housing and social housing does. I know Marie's here from Homes North, so she's the expert on that sort of thing. What council can do is either make land available. We tried to do that in conjunction with Homes New South Wales regarding the Juval site. Homes New South Wales, some of you might have heard, have pulled out of that, so Juval will just remain a ghetto for the time being until the Department of Education decides what it wants to do. It's their land, they call the shots. So that residential stability, I think we're heading down the path there. Local economic rootedness was your second one there, and jobs is key. So if we're looking to grow to 40,000 people, so putting another 10,000 people on our current population, we need to trace that back to jobs. And when it comes to jobs, 4,000 jobs will deliver 10,000 people. There's, spouses and hanger-oners, i.e. kids, those annoying flatmates. I have 3. So 4,000 jobs will equal about 10,000 people. And that's what we're targeting. When you think about what we currently do, what we're good at, and what we're known for, agriculture and education. Agriculture is probably tapped out in terms of growth there. Education could do better, Chris. Schools, but everyone's got an opinion. Hear what I said about enthusiastic amateurs or opinionated amateurs. But where our point of difference is with jobs, admittedly one lot's probably low paying, is intensive horticulture. That is our point of difference in this region. And we've identified another. So currently there's 40,000 hectares under glass up at Gyra, which many of you will know, employs around 900 people. We've identified another 125,000. Sorry, 125,000. We've identified. Did I say 40,000? 40 hectares under glass. We've identified another 125 hectares where we can put glass houses. So that has the potential in itself to deliver the 4,000 jobs. But that's a long-term thing, and we're engaging with those, people to build said glass houses, et cetera, et cetera. They are keen to do it. So that's number one. And the renewable energy zone is the second one. That is going to be the point of difference. It will give us a 10-year bubble in terms of employment. Armidale will be the dormitory for the res. Most of the building will be happening south of here, Walker and Uralla primarily. There's a few generators in the Armidale LGA, but very little further north of us. So that will bring a spike as well. So it's going to be important to try and capture that opportunity as it comes through, so that there will be naturally a development spike, but the ongoing roles as well. So that's where we're headed. And the third thing that Kyle indicated with his CCT was civic engagement. And thank you for mentioning the creative streets that we had 2 weeks ago, 2 Fridays ago. And I did joke, and I'll say it again, and I realise this is exactly the wrong forum to say it, but last Friday, not Friday gone, the one before, perfect time to rob a house. Everyone was downtown in Marsh Street or the mall. I don't know if there was a spike in crime, I'm not so sure, but that amenity is really important. And that is something that we as a region have not been able to do for 30 years. We have had a community with a miserly mind that has impacted council, that has been miserly in everything it's tried to do. And that is reflected in everything that has to do with amenities. So we are in a competition with other regional areas to be an attractive place to live. And to do that, you have to have amenities. You have to have good swimming pools. You have to have good parks. You have to have things for people to do. And, nice as our pool is, it looks a little Soviet era, and not in the good, not in its heyday. So that's, an example. The creeklands look the same as they did when I was a kid. Sometimes nice, depending on the day, but we've got a table drain running through the middle of it. Bike paths, rail trail, all of those sorts of things that need to happen, but have been held back by either a miserly attitude and a very selfish attitude. Again, might be the wrong room. I'm smack in the middle. Mostly those aged over 70 are the loudest voices in this region. Happy to hear from you, but you need to think beyond your cohort. You need to think about the future, and that's something that I think has been missing as well. So those 3 things of residential stability, local economic rootedness and civic engagement are all things that council is working to solve, not necessarily with crime in mind, but really to make it more livable. And I was going to say, if we get that right, when we get that right, we will be the most sought after place. We'll be able to put a population cap. We can say we're capping this at 50,000 people. We'll be beating people off with a stick. That might be after my time, will be after my time, but I know we're on the path there, and that's what we're trying to do. And hopefully I've just outlined the reasons why.
To answer questions. And so we're up to the stage where we're introducing our panel members. Can I introduce 2 more people who are on-the-ground workers? The first one is Samantha Guilbert. Samantha, could you come out? She's a caseworker with Youth on Track, which is a New South Wales government initiative to help young people reduce their risk of reoffending or committing more serious offences. The program works with the young person, their family and other services to help them make better decisions about their life. And what she's going to bring us is a lot of hands-on experience. So I can't wait, Sam. Sam Davies, could you please come out? He's the manager of PCYC in Armidale. This organisation provides activities for young people working in partnership with police to help them develop vocational and leadership skills, stay active and stay away from crime. And so the overall aim is to provide a safe, positive environment that supports personal development and community connection. And Kyle, could you please step forward and join our panel? Okay, so the idea is that I ask our panel members 3 questions to get the conversation going, and then I'm going to throw the conversation out to the audience, and I can see that there are a number of significant people here who do significant work in the field. So I'm hoping that you will comment and ask questions and get the conversation to be quite a lively one. But to begin, We have 2 microphones here that, yes?
Yeah, 1, 2.
Yeah. Okay, Kyle, I'll start with you. From your experience, what are the major factors that you believe lead young people to crime, keeping in mind that you've presented, but the major ones, the big ones in your mind? And what can we do as a rural community to put in place barriers or mediators to these factors?
Yeah, that's a wicked question, isn't it?
I know. I'm
There's
sorry.
so many pathways to crime depending on the young person and their particular circumstance. Um, I won't talk too long because I think I've talked a lot about that. Um, but I really think that those aspects of identity are so important for young people. And it's something that we often overlook. And again, I already spoke about this, but that concept of fun and crime is an interesting one, and it's a real one. The fact that crime provides the things that life can't a lot of the times for young people, whether it is identity, recognition, money, respect, status, these kinds of things. And I think if we don't offer them through civil society, as I've argued, those opportunities, then it's sort of a no-brainer why they'd engage in crime, particularly if their life choices are very clearly, obviously limited by other things, socioeconomic status, these kinds of things. So.
Thank you, Kyle. Sam, in your view, what are the major factors that we need to be aware of and how can we handle them?
So, yeah, in the previous 18 months, I've been working with the young people. I think in my experience, it's the trauma that they've experienced, and then lacking a real psychological resilience to the things that they need to resist day to day. So yeah, like I will see them one day and we're having lunch, everything's fine, and then by Thursday they've been hanging around a group of people, haven't voiced what's going on or been able to say, no, I'm not up for that, and then they're arrested. And so, yeah, I just think there's a real lack of fortitude, like, yeah, that they have to deal with, to make those decisions. And, yeah, so I don't know on a societal level, but education is just really hard for a lot of people to access. I mean, you've got primary school children at grade 1 levels and they're going up to high school. I mean, they're not, yeah, that's not crime, but I mean, it's just very difficult for them. Once they fall behind, they're expected to be amongst it. And, I wouldn't like to be them. It would be so hard, and it just all spirals, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you're saying that the thing that makes them visible is a deficit rather than a strength.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. And they're at such a deficit that makes them invisible. Because it's, yeah, like we're not going to school for 8 months at a time. We're not, what else? Just, it's like stuff that us privileged people can't imagine. Like education, basically. Yeah, it's housing, food, parents. The trauma is just ongoing, and then they've got this opportunity for a rush. What's going to happen? It's and the mastery and the acceptance, and just those few moments of, and unfortunately, youth justice and police, they offer, the good ones offer care, community support. Even Youth on Track, like, it's a pretty good program. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyway, sorry, I hope that answers
It
some.
did. Mayor Coupland.
First of all, acknowledging I'm the least qualified person sitting up here to answer this. So I certainly won't cut across what Sam or Kyle say. I have to fully endorse that. But it's from the tiny sphere that I have any influence over, it really has to be lack of options. And so if, to the extent that we can provide options, we need to. But I think in not just Armidale, but in my travels, going further west and north, and I've spent a lot of time up in North Queensland as well. It's the further you get away from a CBD, the less options there are, which highlights what Kyle was saying. The excitement and other opportunities come forward. So in the 8,623 kilometres that I have any sway over, square kilometres that I have any say over, it's making sure that we aren't falling behind with options to keep people engaged, whether it be it jobs for older people, be it, I guess, activities and amenity for younger people. That's really what we can do. And you put it much more eloquently than this, but crappy places tend to have greater crime. We just need to make sure we are not a crappy place.
Thank you, Sam. There are 3 Sams.
Yeah, we were just talking about that you've just decided to have a panel of Sams, so referring to each other. Yeah. Oh, well, that's
there
what
you go.
Sam Jr. Yeah, first of all, I sort of just want to, I've worked in youth crime now for about just over 10 years, and Kyle, I think no one's made me sound more like a bogan than you explaining youth crime. Pretty much everything you said is our day to day, but the way you sort of articulated it is on another level that we work with. And for Sam Coupland, it was very interesting that you mentioned around it's a very small population, which is the loudest. In my role, I sit forward facing, so I unfortunately don't have a receptionist to field off the community members that come in, and interested saying even around the age demographic, because I sat on a panel this morning for an over 55s men's topic on youth crime, and it's very interesting on what they're worried about, and what we're actually seeing on the ground is a completely different thing. And unfortunately, it's been social media, I know we blame it, but it's very easy to articulate the wrong thing or really look at an issue that we're having on social media. When you're actually looking at the stats, it's a whole nother kettle of fish. And the way I sort of look at it, and Kyle touched on a lot of them, is we talk about these factors, like you said in your question, that there's these commonality factors, but it doesn't necessarily lead to causation.
No.
So we always say around, socioeconomic status and poverty, but that is not a causation of youth crime. We can't just say, oh, well, as soon as someone's net worth is only here, they resort to crime. That's not what we see. And probably in the time that I've spent working with a lot of our young people, when we're talking after they've offended, asking them, did they steal that for a financial gain, is often 0%. It's actually not for financial gain, but yet we talk about one of the main drivers is poverty. So it's not that, that rush to actually get that item to sell it is not the main driver. So yeah, in my role, I look at, and, it's very sport focused around youth crime. So it's a very sort of unique way of looking at things, but we talk a lot about, when we look at sort of younger early intervention programs around these factors, it's like training under 10s. Everyone does the same drills. We just have to look at all the same programs. As we go up the chain and we're looking at more serious offenders, we get into more that sport specific, getting into the roles, and that's where other services come in. In a professional team, the coach doesn't do every single specific role. You actually have other professionals to come in and work with that. So as Kyle was mentioning, a lot of his factors is we're coming in and going, okay, well, we're not the experts in mental health. Who can we come into that? But, I know, sorry, I'm probably speaking a bit too much, but one of the conversations I've never heard someone mention, it was Kyle around talking about this urbanized programs doesn't work in a rural area. And coming from the funding background before I came back into PCYC, it's very interesting that, I mean, Youth on Track's a prime example. It's the same program across the state. We all talk about urbanised programming doesn't work for individual, but yet it's still so embedded into the problem that it is. Youth crime is just the same problem state or national wide. But, as sort of we looked at, it's such a community focus there. So one of the things is we always look at these sort of 10 specific factors that lead to or potentially lead to youth crime, but unfortunately there's no silver bullet to say, lack of parental guidance equals directly, we were unfortunately sent down to Melbourne to do a couple of programs with the police during COVID, and what we found is we were doing a lot of work with CEOs that had an increase of domestic violence due to work from home. So bringing, unfortunately, people that come from roles that there's a lot of obedience in terms of staff, they're getting what they want when they want it straight away. Unfortunately, when work from home happened, we brought that into the home, and there wasn't, they don't have a PA there, and unfortunately that was then brought upon their kids and partners. So, it would be a very easy job if there was, those factors we could just target and go, that's our solving factor right there. But unfortunately, it's like
complicated, isn't it?
It's a complicated role because all of our services see different things every single day and have different factors.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, with our next question, and I wasn't going to divert, but I'm an old behavioural analyst, and so I'm sitting here listening to all of you say that when someone doesn't have reinforcers in their life, in their daily life, they're going to select something that is highly reinforcing. And what we're talking about now on that very basic level is a group of young people who get punishment from their daily lives. They're poor, they're not learning, they're disconnected. So they're highly punishing outcomes for young people. So to get out of punishment, crime must be fantastic, Kyle. Must be a great rush and a great reinforcer.
I wouldn't know.
Well, you know what? I'm sitting here thinking I might have given it a go. Okay. So here's our next question. We all know that we'd like linkages with organisations, local organisations, services, schools and families. We want that to happen in order to create positive alternatives. But how do we do that when different services have different goals and generally one child or one young person would feel their exposure as being quite fragmented to these things? How do we bring them together? What do we do to say, here's a unified plan for you, we're all going to do the same thing? Kyle?
Yeah, so that's a nice, gentle question for me, because I think that's what I tried to argue for, is that services are important, dedicated services. Someone brought up the point of mental health and trauma and these kinds of things. Obviously, there's a need for bespoke services that are addressing particular issues, particular crimes, particular offenses. But I think the point of this approach through crime, through community, is that, again, it ropes all of us in really as members of civil society, as people who participate in the Armidale community. I mean, Sam built perfect connections between, he's absolutely right, council is a tertiary. Unfortunately, they're often the front line for people who are worried about crime. And I've seen it working with other councils, but they have limited mandate and scope to actually address it. But from the work that they do, from the perspective of civic community, actually what they do is part and parcel to crime prevention. And I think we have to start thinking about crime prevention that way. There's always going to be a need and a space for dedicated, specific services that help for particular issues. But if we don't build out community, then we're sort of just going through the motions, I think.
Thank you. Sam, number one, number two, number three, I don't know how to do it. Sam?
I think that's a strength of the Youth on Track program, that they have given it a very wide berth to what it can offer the participant and the family, and the brokerage and stuff. But in saying that, I'm certainly not a psychologist or doctor or you know, all the many things that they need. But I think Penny would be best to answer this with the track side. What she was bringing together up there was, and hopefully still is, going to be amazing, where all the services are working together, you know, at this and going to the young people. Hopefully, it was going to take away them having to come to a white clinical room at centre care. But Youth on Track still goes to the people as well. So I forgot what the question is, but it always feels siloed, I guess.
Yes, that's the issue. So you talked about brokerage. Does that address that issue of we've got many services with one youth?
Youth on Track can financially support someone to see another service like psychology or some yeah, something like that, but it doesn't remove the fragmented need to see a million different people, and they honestly can get confused. Youth on Track have MOUs with Justice Health, and that's been really helpful. But yeah, it's difficult, but I don't think we need any more youth services, as been mentioned. We need to collaborate and make the most of it. There's so much, you know, there's an abundance in the community, but I don't believe it's utilised as much as it could be.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
that's an interesting comment. Thank you.
For sure. Yep.
Sam too. I'd framed an answer, but I've forgotten your question.
The question was that often when young people are in difficulty, they get access to a lot of different services and a lot of different supports, which are quite fragmented. So that I'm sure they sometimes leave thinking, what am I supposed to do with this information? So is there a council perspective on this about how we bring people together?
Not yet. I'm informed by the ever reliable Liam Metheringham over here that we are about to release or prepare or put on public exhibition our
salesman right there. But I think you're listening to him now, it's probably one of the best buys I think we could probably do to get some research done and a bit of more of an understanding about crime in Armidale. So obviously you guys have UNE, the School of Criminology there. You guys have done it with other council areas, and I don't think we can do anything without having good data to inform it. Otherwise, we're pissing in the wind. So yeah, we'll be getting that underway hopefully in the new year.
This is our crime prevention.
Yep, crime prevention plan. Yep.
Crime prevention plan. So we'll be putting that together. However, as a tertiary part of the cog in all of this, the one thing the council does have, not lots of, just need to caution you with that, is money and sometimes facilities. And as I mentioned before, this place has been world-class at problem identification. If you have a solution, that's what we want to hear. So solutions need to come together, not as thought bubbles, but as plans. So I reckon I'm currently running at about 50-1 in terms of ratios of thought bubbles to plans that I receive. So we're here and willing to help. And you approach it, and there's different avenues you can come into, directly to council and say, hey, here's our plan. But grant funding has been whispered, so that's at a smaller level. But we also have just baked into budgets serious money running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars for proper, well thought out plans that we can support. So what can council do? We can listen. I note my fellow councillor Susan McMichael's here. She's chairs a group called the Livable Region Key Pillar Working Group. She's very plugged into the community. Go to her, listen. But what we need from the community is well thought out plans, and then we can put some oomph behind it, because we do not have the answers, but the things we do have are what others don't. And so we need to direct that sensibly, because that's what you do. When you've got public money, you need to spend it sensibly in a considered way.
This is probably the worst answer you can possibly give, but for 10 years, we've been asking that same question. How do all the services come together, and how do we share our knowledge, and how do we work better? I wouldn't say we've come anywhere close to solving it. And there's a number of factors there as well. It's, short-term funding is trying to create, council portals of what type of services are around. And then within 6 months, it's completely null and void because funding or services have changed, and young people are trying to go to phone numbers or emails that have no responses. So I know we're sort of talking about rural communities as almost the negative, but in this case, it's the positive. Because of community, because we're so small, the ability to have a warm referral, I believe, is actually so much greater than a metro area. There's 10 or 20 services in this room that we've all got that ability to walk a young person to another service and say, nice to meet you. Do you want to meet this person? And we've got a better understanding of what we do. So, you talked about communities all coming together. Yes, services is one aspect of it too, but having that connectedness to family, and often, unfortunately, in our world, we talk about you've been in the youth crime space too long in PCYC if you've had to, unfortunately, arrest the young person's parent when they were a youth offender. But it's having that community connectedness now of going, well, hang on, we know family, we know relatives, we know other services. So in this point, being a small community is definitely a positive for that connectiveness for sure.
And I guess you're talking about being a rural community means that there's more capacity to build close relationships with people and build rapport with the young people that you're working with. So they build trust in you.
100%. Then trust in service is the number one, especially when working with young people, I believe. But yeah, also having that knowledge of what the other services and the trust in the other services we can do to have that referral. But yeah, really having that warm referral going, let's meet so-and-so, let me take you to meet so-and-so versus here's a services card, give them a call. There's that barrier of then breakdown. But if you have that one tight knitted community, yeah, you're just going to have that spectrum with the young person, hopefully through the whole service. So,
That's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, our last question. It's the last one, but I think it's probably the most important one. We're talking about young, I'm talking about young people as a group of people we have to do things with. We have to help them. But what about their voice? How do we encourage them to have a strong voice that allows us to include them in shaping solutions for themselves, building communities that they believe are meaningful? How do we do this? I actually don't know, but there you go, Kyle.
Don't think I know either, but I'll try. It's actually interesting you say that, because someone raised to me the importance of having even a young person's voice on a panel such as this,
Yes.
right? Like understanding the academic perspective is one thing, understanding the practical or working perspective is another thing, but what do they understand and how do they understand it is important. And I think I'll beat a dead horse and go back to civic community, but I think that's it. These are the opportunities for young people to have buy-in. To have buy-in to community and to civil society is more important. It's not a subculture or youth-specific community over here. It's a cohesive community that includes everyone and ideally provides them not only with buy-in and opportunity, but a voice through engagement. If you engage in civil society, you engage in community, you have opportunity for voice. Now, through the ways we do community that I spoke about, it's important for those people in positions of power who run particular institutions, council, news agencies, these kinds of people to create that opportunity for young people to have a voice. But I think it's a bit of participation and responsibility on young people as well to come out.
Yes.
Just again, in my experience, yeah, it's got to be pretty fun, and yeah, short, fun and short options. They're just, yeah, that's my, yeah, I'm really not too sure. At Headspace, they have like a council there, and it's got the bare minimum that come along. And the Youth Week, we didn't really get much off the ground, but yeah, it's just yeah, it's a pretty, I think, a challenging thing. But I like the idea that it's not a different section of society. You know, we just need to be one, but it's a difficult task.
It is, isn't
Yeah,
it? Mayor Coupland, does your council have anything for these young people to stand up and tell us what they think of us?
No, because I'd be scared of the response. But in all honesty, there are other councils that do have a youth council. We don't, and that's not necessarily by design. But I certainly wouldn't be averse to it. But I'd want that to be more of a grassroots led thing. Otherwise, we'll run into the challenges that Sam number one mentioned. So you know, you don't just want to be pushing something for the sake of it being pushed. This is one of those things. If there's a bunch of kids that came and said, "Hey, we really want a voice, and this is how we want to do it," fill your boots. But when me as a middle-aged white man, whom everyone loves to hear from, if I were to push it, it would just seem it just seem tokenistic. And I am dead against tokenistic. I don't necessarily want a youth council to, to come back to the enthusiastic amateur thing that I was talking about before. So if it was led from the ground and there was a pathway or some definitive goals they wanted to achieve, come on in.
Go for it. Okay, Sam.
Yeah, I actually couldn't agree more with that. The risk of it being tokenistic. I used to have a youth advisory council, and even when we were talking about this a while ago, there was that same concept of it's a certain selective group who come to that, and unfortunately, often it's designed for the result to work at maybe youth at risk, what activities can we create, but unfortunately the panel is often made up, and I know I'm generalizing here, of quite well-off young people that makes it look quite good on their resume to go to university.
Okay.
So it's really and it was super difficult. Like, it's something that I couldn't solve overnight, but it's like, how do you make it inclusive that everyone is invited for, but selective enough that the young people that you want on it are going to be on there, not just a selective group of young people who are pushing for that. So, and we use the example of, I think the final event of the youth was Cinema Under the Stars, and we were talking with a lot of our young people why you didn't attend, and it was like, well, I wouldn't be caught dead there. So it was like, hang on, the event was to target young people at night to stop youth offending, but every young person that we're dealing with who are youth offending wouldn't dare go there and watch an animated movie. So it was like, it's this concept of bugger, like what it was designed for from youth missed the mark.
Yeah.
So you're talking about tokenistic. It's like, yeah, it's how do we get the people that we need on there to design that and give them that voice and give them that pride. One of the concepts, actually using Liam here, we was Inverell talking about, I don't know how to word this in a bit nicer terms, but wherever there was a spray painted appendage around town, they put a bit of art. So the young people actually went, okay, instead of doing a scrub it off and paint over it, instead of the council just painting over it white, yeah, they decorated them. So they created artwork and painted over them. And then what we saw is, especially over the skate park, is that was then that pride of, that's my artwork. Don't tag it. Yeah. So like, But it's that concept of, and I know council was sort of, we only talked about this because I know you guys are doing the painting the or the power boxes. And, I'd love to actually see the data is the tagging on the green light boxes that aren't painted versus the ones that are painted.
Yeah.
Be very interesting. But, Kyle touched on it, is giving that purpose,
Yes.
giving that's ours. We did that, is going to be so much more than council spent $6 million on jazzing this up.
Yeah.
Youth might spend $200 to paint a power box, but that's ours. And I think that's very powerful.
Thank you. Okay, enough questions from me. I'm going to open questions to the floor. So let's start the conversation, or let's continue the conversation.
Everyone's only going to want to ask Sam questions, aren't they?
Sam one.
Sam, too.
Kyle, I think this is a question for you, but it's not in the, maybe it's not for this audience, but I live in North Queensland, and there have been a push for adult crime, adult time, and they say it works. Is it pushed by a particular demography, and is there any study world over that this works long term? I already know the answer, but
Yeah, sure.
how do they push it?
I guess it depends on what you want to do. Does prison work? Yes, it warehouses people and stops them from committing crime for a period of time. If you believe that young people should be in prison from the age of 14 until they die in prison, then it might work, but we know that that's not the reality. So it's a difficult one, because I think someone already alluded to it on the panel. It's also an issue of perception versus reality. And the perception is of a criminal justice system that's quite soft on crime. That's the public perception, significant in every survey we've ever done. Is that true? It depends on what you're measuring and what you're looking at. It has to be done intelligently. I think there's a really good example in Canada, actually, where I come from, where believe it or not, it has extremely low imprisonment rates compared to comparator jurisdictions. But in the early 2000s, it actually had one of the highest youth incarceration rates in the world. It surpassed the United States. And despite that, the public was still calling and clamoring for more, because there were high-profile cases of a shooting in a mall, or a drunk driver running over someone's mother, or something like this that really boils up that anxiety. So there's a theory in political science, the shortness of it is called doing good by stealth. So it's trying to do the right thing is not always the popular thing in politics. So the way you do the right thing is by stealth. And what I mean by that is the practical example in Canada was they turned up the punitiveness as hard as they could, but they turned it up for offenders that were 1 in a million, right? Multiple murderers, these types of things. While at the same time, they took prison as an option away for every other minor offense. So the public focused on their red meat, what they got, that multiple murdering 14-year-olds, which are 1 in a trillion, would be sent to jail for life. But what really happened over the next 10 years is the youth incarceration rate halved. So what looked like a mean, punitive bill and approach to crime on the surface actually served to reduce crime. So I think it's about smart legislation rather than emotive legislation. And it's really hard to separate emotion when it comes to crime. It really is. It affects us all. I think the other thing that is unique about place and space and about rural communities is our research that's looked into fear of crime looks at how place can shape that. And one thing we've tried to look at is that psychological distance to crime. So less crime in terms of number of offenses might happen in a rural environment, but for many people living in that community, it can feel a lot closer because they know the person, or they know the person, or the person is friends of that person, and they hear about it, and you talk about it at the Goldfish Bowl or wherever you go, and sort of it becomes town discourse. And since I've lived here, I've seen that a number of times where there's been like, a break-in in a prominent individual's house, and that's sort of become the mainstay of what everyone and everything's experiencing. The data tells us otherwise, but that doesn't mean that we can ignore those feelings, because those feelings are real and true, and those feelings drive policy, and those feelings drive politics. So we have to engage with them. We just have to engage with them a little intelligently, I think.
Any other questions or comments? We have service providers here.
Thank you. I'm Diana Eads, and I'm here from ANTAR, or the local reconciliation group. One thing that we haven't really heard about is that it's quite a diverse community in this region. And in fact, in the state, there's an overwhelming overrepresentation of Aboriginal young people in the criminal justice statistics. So anything we talk about, whether it's the model of early intervention which came through the recent government inquiry, or whether it's Kyle's more holistic and, I have to say, rather promising way of looking at it, we really have to make sure that Aboriginal voices are front and centre. I say that as a non-Aboriginal person, but as a person who talks a lot to Aboriginal people within the reconciliation framework. And I'll just mention about that, some people here will be aware that the state government did a parliamentary inquiry into community safety in regional and rural communities. They've put out their first report, and the government's responding to it at the end of November. Then they're going to have a second report as well. And the subtitle of their first report was addressing the drivers of youth crime through early intervention. And that's, you know, as we say, we've seen a more holistic way of looking at it. But there are a lot of very positive things in there, and it's a very forward-thinking report. But I just want to read finding 8 from the report. Effective early interventions for First Nations young people need to be co-designed with elders and community, and must focus on strengthening connections to culture and country. I'd like us just to be mindful of those issues. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? We have 2 hands here.
Which one? Hi, yes, I would just like to say I'm Anne Ricks and I manage New England Family Support. We have a lot of young people come through our doors who are experiencing challenges of one kind or another. And it sounds a bit trite, but you've got to walk alongside people. And I think the whole panel has been very, far-thinking in that it's the voices of young people. We cannot impose solutions upon people. And it's around hearing what people actually might suggest around solutions to their own challenges. I remember working with a community, I won't name the community, where, arson was quite a big problem. And I asked young people, I said, arson's a problem, you're burning things. And they actually said, yeah, well, we'd quite like to join the Rural Fire Service. And so it was around a solution of, encouraging mentoring and support from the Rural Fire Service. And in that community, that was taken up quite well by young people who then virtually policed the arsonists themselves. They said, if you start a fire, we've got to come out. Mightn't suit us. So, that's sort of, I guess, relying on the intelligence and capability. And some people who experience the most disadvantage are often the most resilient and the most imaginative. And people will come up with solutions if you give them the opportunity to do this. And, I agree with Mayor Coupland, you don't want a tokenistic youth council. You want voices of young people that are genuinely heard and respected. And then we have to keep our promises. If we say we walk with them to do something, then we need to keep those promises. And if I've learned anything in life, you've got to be good to your word and true to your word. And that makes a difference.
Thank you, Anne.
I'm Nene. I am from New England Family Support Service, and thank you so much for, the presentation and all the discussions we've had tonight. There have been some really good points that have stood out for me in this. I think the starter for me was when you mentioned that tonight we want to have a shift from that deficit-based view to actually get to recognize and leveraging the strength, in youth. And that is very powerful. And piggybacking off that, Psalm number 3 did mention that there are people here from Backtrack. And I remember very well, a few months ago, I attended a program here in this very hall, and there was a gentleman from Backtrack who gave a very brilliant talk. And then he mentioned that during the period when we were having the high spate of violence and youth crime and vandalism and burning of cars and stuff, he mentioned something that was so simple yet so big that Backtrack did that significantly reduced the crime rate that was going on at the time. And what he said they did was they went on the drawing board and started racking their brain. How do we tackle this? How do we attend? But what they discovered was we need to call some young people on board. We need to have them on the table. So they reached out to few people who they know were have records and history of, crime and all of that, and said, this is what we have on hand. How do we tackle it? And bang, 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 everybody put in their ideas. And by the time you know it, they were getting into their cars, going and knocking on doors where they know, okay, this person might be involved. And those people actually ended up being the agents of change in that situation. And he gave us statistics of how dramatically the crime rate reduced. And really, if we're to talk about when Kylie mentioned civic engagement, this is where it comes in. Really getting to engage, having young voices in matters like this. For example, we should be having young people here tonight, having young voices, in important discussions like this, so that, for example, even with council, they can help with community planning. When we have disaster preparedness and management, young people can contribute so much. So I think that for us is the, beginning and point and foundation that we can build upon. And she also mentioned something very important. If we look at the New England Northwest region, one of the blessings of this region is that it's so rich and diverse and multicultural. And most times we tend to see programs that are one size fits all. How do we cater for the nuances and diversity? Having that cultural lens, and so that we provide appropriate services that are culturally, culturally responsive care, if you would like, for lack of a better word. And I think that would go a very long way. So yes, you're right. It's time we have that shift from the deficit-based, way of viewing all of this, and really get to leverage on the strength that we already have within these young people. They have so much ideas. Sometimes they're bored because people don't engage them. So much ideas to tap into, to really leverage as services. And someone also mentioned the silos, for example. So coming from community service organization, I would say it's something that was really a problem, and I think it's still, but we are no longer where we used to be in terms of, for example, now we have cases where we do service, that we call it conference case management, because now services are beginning to realize, you have these clients, one client will be provided the same service, and at the end of the day, they have 5 different needs. They have received support from 5 different services for the same thing. So now services are beginning to connect more. How do we partner? How do we collaborate? What are you doing? What do I need to do? What is this other person doing? Like I said, we're not out of the woods yet. There's still a lot that needs to be done, but I want to believe that services are beginning to see the gaps. Services are beginning to rise up to the challenge and see how do we better channel our resources so we are not doubling up on support, because ultimately, if you're going to support someone, you want them to have a better outcome. Yeah, better outcome cannot be achieved when 5 services provide the same support. And then at the end of the day, yes, he or she has gotten support from 5 services, but what are the support? What was, So yeah, there is so much going on, but at the same time, we have so much resources here within us that we can tap into, like not from the deficit-based, approach, but really from a strength-based approach, like utilizing. And for example, like the cultural diversity, look at all the beautiful cultures we're beginning to get added into the mix. If we are able to really properly like tap into that, there is so much benefit that would come into the region.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Marie. Marie, could you introduce yourself and your service?
Yes, I'm Marie McKenzie, the CEO of Homes North Community Housing. We provide social and housing and homelessness services and support services. I wanted to go back to Kyle, your presentation, and you're really looking at fundamentals of change. And when I look at that table that you had of the measure, all the different levels, it seems to me that for that to shift the dial on all of that, you need leadership. You need vision and you need leadership. And I'm going to look at Sam, number 3 here. It's place-based. It's place-based. And when you look at Australia and you look at our communities, I always see councils are where the closest we've got to an organisation that has us all in mind as a place. And it'd be interesting to hear your view on that, Sam. And I look at some of the regional areas and some that have flourished. They were the councils that in the era of go back to rates and rubbish, keep out of society and community, that era, the councils that did that, community suffered. And the councils that didn't, that kept their brief around community, they survived and flourished. That's what I see over the decades of what's happened. So it'd be interesting to see and I feel that you are taking on that role with your growth, and you really are, and you've said it yourself when you addressed us. You are addressing those domains that Kyle showed us. The evidence is important and fundamental to young people thriving. What's the solution around leadership, and who holds that vision, and who's the driver?
It's Kyle. I will hand it back to someone, but you're probably leaving it there more as a question. I agree wholeheartedly with what you say there, Marie. It is such a trite thing for people to say council's there for roads, rates and rubbish. I mean, rates fund your roads and your rubbish. But that doesn't build any community. That's a really selfish approach. And so I do agree with you, those that have taken on community, made that central and thought about how can we expand the livability, they have thrived. But they can only do that with money. And in regional New South Wales, councils are structurally set up to fail financially. That's an absolute truism. Queensland is different. They do it better. They can set their own rates. We can't. And so in regional New South Wales, Armidale in particular, so when Susan and I came on last term, other than set a growth agenda, we also raised the rates by 50%. And we had to do that so that we could do these things that we're now trying to do. Otherwise, we just become poverty-stricken in every sense. We become a poorer community because we're a poorer council, and away you go. But to do that, you've got to be prepared to stand up and say, this is the right thing to do. Now throw things at us. And people did. It's easier to do in a comparatively large council like Armidale because you can hide. In a small place, the smaller councillors, people just yell at you on the street. And that's just the reality. So thanks for acknowledging this. I do believe to do what we're trying to do, you need money. People, you get what you pay for. So hopefully we'll deliver. Sure. Do I have to listen?
Is more place-based funding of programs, and that potentially communities hold funding and decide how they're going to spend it, and the community is then accountable for the outcomes as well. So there have been examples where they did pool a lot of funding, and it was up to the community to decide and deliver and live and breathe the outcomes of their own funding. So I don't know if there's examples, Kyle, you know, when that's actually happened, but I think we need to do more of that. At this point in time, funding comes from very random places, and most of the time we don't even know that it's landed.
Thank you. I'm Blake Sloan. I'll put on my old. So I was formerly the Pro Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous and Student Success at Charles Sturt University. So I live in Armidale. My family have got familial connections to Armidale. And something I think you've got a really unique opportunity. Your point about you don't want lots of passionate people coming up with half-baked ideas. I think you've got a really good opportunity to look for brilliance at scale in what you're actually doing. So just my own sort of personal opinion, you have a chance to be like the driver of interoperability between a lot of the service providers that are here locally. So we've just had the comment about place-based decision-making and place-based funding. You're uniquely positioned with that huge square kilometre footprint to be able to sit there and say, well, we can actually bring you together, given you're operating for the social good of our area. You could actually be a driver in making tomorrow better than yesterday, in the fact that you are responsible for all the areas. And you've got all these organisations that are here for the common good. And if you had the chance to get them interoperable and working together, I think that's such a unique way that we could actually do it that no one else has been brave enough to do. So we've got a really unique sort of position in our little microcosm of Armidale to build out a place where you have people who know someone or know exactly in Kyle's example, you know someone who's been impacted and they can share a story for how it might not have happened, or they might have known the family circumstances. So I think you've got a really, really good position just sitting and listening to all the yarns today around, you know, there's the other saying as well, like when you make the invisible visible, the impossible can become possible. So I think you've got a really good chance, a bit like aspiration building for the young people to serve on something like a non-tokenistic youth council. If you actually built it and incentivised young mob and showing them why it's so important to turn up, because you can be a voice for those that maybe, well, I don't want to use the cliche of the voiceless, but you can be empowered and represent your community, or you could even be a kid who was low SES, First Nations, first in family, to a town such as this, and look at all of these people who are doing the common good and banding together when the rest of the world has us all operating in silos. So I just wanted to actually call it, you've got a really unique opportunity to do some really amazing good through your corporate social responsibility and CSO.
Thank you. Christina?
Well, first of all, I must say I'm incredibly impressed. This is an amazing group to be working together, and I think that the bits are all here and it's doing what civil society should do. An enormous amount of knowledge. I have a real question. I mean, as it were, it's a question, and it's you, Sam Davis, mentioned and pushed straight aside social media. Now, we're in a time of moral panic about social media and of legislation, which goodness knows what's going to happen. But I'm thinking back to the 1990s, where there was a scholar from, I must say, Manhattan, Douglas Rushkoff, who talked, when he was talking about television viewing, that his only friends were on television when he was a kid. And that's really important. And as we're thinking about these civic spaces, surely among the young, these new social media spaces are part of our identity. And how do they play into all of the issues about having recognition, having identity? We know how they play in to making you feel fat and plain, because that's what the newspapers tell us about. But how can we use the social media in ways, and how do you build a bit into the model?
Sorry, I was just going to touch on because it was actually something we spoke on yesterday, and I mean, probably people don't watch the free-to-air news anymore, but we actually, there's still, yeah, there's still a few. But one of the big conversations we were actually discussing, and you mentioned it just then, is the new ban on under 16-year-olds in social media. We've had nothing but groups that are what I won't say extremely upset about it, but in that thing because they're losing that identity because the identity is the social media, and now taking that away, I think there's actually going to be some consequences that we haven't actually foreseen there. But one of the prime examples is what we use all the time, and I'm in a pretty privileged position working with the police. Is I get to see the real stats like coming out of the court system, and like you talk about, my only friends are on TV, and, back in the day, if someone got broken entered, you'd only know if you were in that friend group or that family group. Now everyone knows straight away. And one of the big driving forces is now in economic development is crime. We're actually privileged. We've got a few people here. It's a small world from Townsville. And we often talk about, it's a city that is on the beach and you can still buy a house for 500,000 overlooking the beach, and crime is horrendous. And it's one of those things where people go, it's a beautiful place, but the crime. So how do we look at actually stopping that? Let's just publicize, the wrong, but how do we also use it as a good? I think it's going to be tricky that a 16-year-old won't have access to it, and then one day they can just open up this whole new world. I don't think that's going to stop under 16-year-olds on it whatsoever, but I guess that's another debate. But it's at the moment we're looking in Armidale, we're looking at probably, don't quote me on this. I know there's a lot of academics in the room using round figures is probably a taboo, but there's probably the main youth offenders is probably 10 in Armidale that do probably 80% of the crime. And from the stats is maybe even 70% of them are actually not from Armidale, but are doing the crime in Armidale. So if you look at the social media, it's absolutely everywhere, lock your home because you're going to get broken into every single night. Your car's going to get stolen, but really it is that small demographic. But unfortunately in Armidale, if you have 2 or 3 families or a couple of young people that come in and do a spate of break and enters, the box of stats can increase very quickly. So, we can go from no crime to a lot of crime very quickly. But yeah, for me, social identity is so important with the social media. So, the blanket rule of it's just a bad thing, everyone just puts on their social, like their highlight reel, and it should be banned because it gives unreal expectations, I think is just a dangerous game of just saying, well, let's just ban it. So
interesting.
I mean, the doctor in the field might be able to answer it a bit better than I can, but
I won't say too much about my opinion on young people and social media use. I've probably read too much Jonathan Haidt and his work, and it scared me a little bit. So, as someone with 2 young kids, I like it, but maybe I should broaden my reading horizons a bit more. I think though that you can't get past that. You talked about all my friends are on TV. I had a mate here in Armidale. And they'd been here for a long time. Their kid was deeply embedded in school and sport and all these types of things. And they had to move because he lost his job and he was going to take up a job elsewhere. And so I was talking to his son. I said, oh man, aren't you going to miss your friends? Like, it must be really tough on you. And I thought, it must be so hard. I think he was going into like grade 6 or something, like really, really. I couldn't imagine moving as a young kid in grade 6 from all my friends. And he goes, no, they're all online. We just play, what's that game? Fortnite. And so I'll see them still after school every day. And I just, that just blew my mind, was that the main place he's engaging with his friends are online in a gaming ecosystem. So he didn't care that he was moving 5 hours away. And I use that example to just show that obviously the way young people think is very, very different than I'd think. I was born in 88 and a child of the 2000s, and it's all well and truly surpassed me already. So I think you're absolutely right. I haven't thought that through enough to have an intelligent commentary on this. But engagement in civil society, as I've tried to present here today, probably cannot avoid that social media stream or that route, whether it is trying to reach out through youth through that mechanism or create opportunities through that mechanism. It's just we're in a whole new environment, and rapidly so, with AI evolution and all these other types of things happening. So I think you're absolutely right. And it's something that swings that pendulum the other way about access for young people. And actually, by loss of access, what else will they lose access to through that? And it's something to think about.
Mm. And I guess that's especially relevant when we look at young people with a neurodevelopmental condition, who are heavily dependent on sometimes non-face-to-face contact socialisation. Okay, we've come to the end of our question time, and I'd like to thank the speakers, but also you guys. It's been an amazing conversation. I feel like we need to sign a pact in blood about coming together again for part B of this, but that could just be me. So thank you very much, panel members. I'm hoping that you have felt as inspired as I have, and your input has been amazing. So before we finish off, I have two more tasks. The first one is to invite Alex Cook, who is the Interim Director of Where We Are Now, the UNE Smart Regional Incubator, to tell us a little bit about this community. And thank you for hosting us, Alex.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Alex, for those of you I haven't met. I'd just like to acknowledge Uncle Steve up the back and the Anawan people. So thanks for having us, Steve. I'm so glad that you made it tonight. Thank you to all of you for that very rich discussion. There's obviously a lot of layers in terms of all of these pieces that come together to basically outline what the future is like for young people in regional and rural areas, and we're all involved in that. I will touch on that a little bit more in a little bit more detail in just a minute, but the Smart Region Incubator is a startup hub based here in the region. We predominantly operate in the New England Northwest, but we have a footprint across various sectors, including ag, health, creative industries and clean tech. And one of our sort of, I guess, focus areas that we have been spending a lot more time working in is youth innovation and pathways for youth to basically build out their ideas and their future, and to see themselves in their communities, and, you know, for places like Armidale to actually stay here and to continue living and operating here and thriving here in these regions. We run a youth innovation program that has been going remarkably well, I'm really pleased to report, in the New England Northwest. And we basically go and we meet students in their schools. We predominantly do that across 4 different sites: Maureen, Narrabri, Armidale and Tamworth. And we run innovation challenges with these students. We usually have focus areas that we bring to them with various problem statements that are usually industry specific. And we get them thinking about their ideas to some of the complex challenges that industries in our regions and our communities are facing, and coming up with solutions themselves, often in groups together, to come up with ideas to solve those problems. And they work on these ideas together and they pitch them as a group to a panel of judges and to their peers and to us who are also there. And some of the ideas that these young people have are incredible. I think young people often get a bad rap. I sometimes still think of myself as a young person, and then I very quickly, as I'm meeting all these young people, I'm like, I'm not quite there anymore. I'm mid-30s, and so I feel young, but I'm not that young. And it's like, oh, you're amazing, and these young people really do have an incredible outlook when you give them the opportunity and the space to be able to share and to connect with you and engage with you. One thing I would like to touch on is, you were all sort of talking about this idea of place, and I've spent a little bit of time recently out west in Western New South Wales with some really incredible First Nations communities in the Māori Pāki region. And it's been really interesting, that link between identity and place, and where you are, and connection to family, and how there are many people and many things involved in what makes a young person feel connected to themselves and to their community. And it's there's a lot of accountability, I think, that we have as the adults to be visible and to talk to young people and to realize that it isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, you know, for our community, for communities in Western New South Wales, for First Nations communities, for more Western communities. You know, it's diverse and it's really different. And so the approach has to be different, different works and different lands. So I do just want to say thank you to everyone for coming this evening. You know, if you have ideas yourself about how you might want to contribute to young people and their futures in the innovation space in particular, and connecting in with industry, or how services could work with, you know, the program that we're running, and how we could work with you and support the work you do, please come and chat to me after. I'd love to keep the conversation going. So thank you again. Thank you to the Royal Society of New South Wales. It's a pleasure to host events like this here and to keep them going. So let's keep them going and keep inviting more people in. So thank you.
Can I now invite the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research, Professor Chris Armstrong, to deliver the vote of thanks to our fantastic speakers and also to close our event. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Vicki. And also thanks, Alex, for hosting us here today. And I'd also like to particularly acknowledge Uncle Steve, who's an old friend from the university, and our elder in residence and other First Nations people here tonight. Particularly thanks to Vicki and Trevor, who's done so much to organise tonight. So it's really Trevor Brown up the back, Vicki Bitsika here. It's so fantastic that you could do this. And Christina, thanks so much for coming up from Sydney, and thanks for spending the day here. We're spending some time with Christina tomorrow as well, so that'll be really good. It was great to hear. I loved hearing the history that you gave of the Royal Society of New South Wales. It's really interesting. It's, you know, over 200 years old now, and you do see the changes that happen over time. But I really liked the way that you're thinking about how the Royal Society can move forward. And I think it's examples of events like this where we're talking about kind of complex issues, but of real community need. I think, just speaking from the perspective of the university, that type of thinking is where we're at with the university. We're developing a new strategy for the university, but firmly within that strategy it's how do we, as a university embedded in regional communities, Armidale is our head office, our biggest campus, Taree, Tamworth and Western Sydney as well. How do we as a university better engage and connect and contribute to community, to individuals, to businesses in communities in regional areas, and to social groups as well? And how do we become a trusted partner for communities? I think actually it was interesting, Kyle, I really liked the way that the kind of approach that you're talking about, which is really building on and using the affordances of very normal structural parts of community, density, having people around, having a strong economy, having housing that's sustainable and affordable, and also kind of continual, bringing people together, using organisations or groupings or community clusters that are already here. But when you were talking and you pitched that as a solution for young people, but it's also the solution for old people, and it's a solution for lonely people, and it's the solution for people with disabilities, and it's the solution for people who are new to town. It's kind of a solution that has many problems that it can solve in one. And I guess for Sam, number 2, Mr. Mayor, I guess that's why a council is already doing some of those things, because they completely make sense for community and us as a society. It makes sense to run a community like that because it supports everyone. So being able to use those, particularly thinking about youth crime, I think was really powerful. I'd like to kind of thank Sam for Youth on Track and PCYC Sam as well, because you gave that really kind of in-depth, real-world, coal-facing experience of dealing with individuals one-on-one, thinking about how they can express themselves, but also how you can work with them to grow them. I think that was really powerful. And the questions as well, they were really great questions. And some of the sort of themes that came up were really very powerful. But one of the particular themes was about active engagement. And I think sorry, the second table from the end, and I think you were talking about how an approach is actually to go out and find the people that were actually causing the problem, bring them into the conversation, have them be part of the solution, whether it's about putting out fires or something else. But then the PCY, Sam, you then said, I think it was you mentioned that in Armidale, it's 10 people. It's 8 people, it's 10 people causing 80% of the problem. I thought, is there a way that we can engage with those 10 people or those 4 families or however many families there are very actively, but in a positive way, bring them in very actively in to help solve the problem, like your example up there. So I think there was so much came out of tonight. So I really would like to thank everyone and thank the audience. It's great to have such a diverse audience with real experience, but real passion as well and real interest. So thanks for coming. It's great to be working with Royal Society folks like Vicki and Trevor. We've got other projects on the boil. We had a real, very, very, very interesting event on women in STEM, which we want to keep doing. We want to keep that theme going. There's other themes as well. I think Lou Conway up the back, hello, who's the founder of the Founder Space here. But Lou had an event last year with the Royal Society on renewable energy, and that's another theme that we will keep doing definitely, not only with Armidale, but with our other areas in this region. So I might close there, but I'd just like to thank everyone. We've got some nibbles and drinks up the back, so welcome people to come and have an orange juice and an apple juice and a roll. But thanks for coming, and we'll keep in touch on what our next events are like and when they are, and we'd really welcome you to come along. So thanks everyone.